one.
Hello, my name is Carter Rains, and today I'm going to be talking about D-Day, where the tide brought the turn. D-Day was on June 6, 1944, where approximately 4,900 Allied troops during World War II were killed or wounded in one of the most important battles the entire world has ever seen. Before I can really talk about the details of D-Day, allow me to create some context. So in World War II, there were two sides. It was the Allied powers versus the Axis powers. Now, the Allied powers were made up of four main players, and this was Britain, the Soviet Union, the United States, and China, while having 15 other independent nations that were a part of the Allied effort. Most notably was Canada. Now, on the Axis side, we had Germany, Italy, and Japan. For the sake of today's presentation, I'm going to focus mainly on Germany's role in World War II due to the fact of their involvement with the D-Day invasion. Now, at this point in the war, Axis powers, mainly Germany, had dominated Europe, as you can see in this map. On the eastern side, you have the Soviet Union, and over here in the west, you have Great Britain, and anything in blue was occupied by Allied nations at this point in 1944, right before the D-Day invasion occurred. So, to understand what's happening here on the eastern side, the Soviet Union and Germany had been raging a ruthless war on that side for many years here. And then down here you can see where Italy had been halfway occupied by the Allied forces due to their invasions of Italian territories in northern Africa and then up into the Italian peninsula itself. With the Soviets on the eastern side taking the blunt of the German military might, Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, demands the other United Nations join the attack on Germany by opening up a Western Front. This happened for many years and ultimately boiled down to when these three met in person for the first time at the Tehran Conference in Iran in 1943. Now, right here is first on the left side is Joseph Stalin, communist leader of the Soviet Union, and in the middle we have Franklin Roosevelt, President of the United States, and on the far right is the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. So at this conference between these three strong military leaders, Joseph Stalin is again demanding that the other Allied nations open up that two-sided front. Churchill and FDR, fearing that the communist influence in the nations that they would have to move across to defeat Germany would be extremely strong and ultimately dangerous in the post-war effort after everything settled down, that communist influence would be extremely dangerous for these democratic and free nation leaders. With that being understood, they knew that they had to meet with the Soviet Union's forces in the middle to ultimately take out Nazi Germany and defeat the regime. So they decide to agree and attack on the Western Front, and they choose France as their entry point because of its proximity to the British Isles and its ability to cross the English Channel made it the most practical place to do so. At the same time, the French people themselves had great Allied sentiment, and the French military would have been a part of the Allied forces if it had not been dominated early on in the war by German military forces. However, to make an attack successful for the Allied powers, they had to break through what was called Germany's Atlantic Wall. Now, Germany's Atlantic Wall spanned from the top of Norway all the way down across Europe to the bottom of France, a total of 3,000 miles which was not an actual wall, like a stone wall like you would think, but rather a combination of thousands of separate structures that created a modern military fortress of just complete destruction for anybody who wanted to invade. This was a combination of steel reinforced bunkers that had connecting tunnels with artillery batteries and garrisons as a complex system working together. And at the same time, on the beach, there were intense minefields, barbed wire, and booby traps like hedgehogs and tetrahydras. Now these hedgehogs and tetrahydras you can see in that picture on the far right, where they were metal or wooden poles and had been dug into the sand that where the water went for high tide, put it in a situation that if there were to be an invasion during high tide, it would rip the bottom of the boats open, causing them to sink and the men not being able to make it to shore. If instead the invaders attempted to go and land during low tide, they would have to run across a very long beach and a complex field of, again, that barbed wire in those mines. With Germany and its leaders expecting that attack from the Allies, the Allies needed to draw military defenses away from their desired attack point. Thus, they created Operation Fortitude, and this was a plan of deception. Now, the Allies needed to confuse the Germans where their attack was actually coming from. And to do so, they decided to create two fake infantries and that stationed them in different positions and able to confuse Hitler and his army. But what do I mean by a fake infantry? Well, American and British forces came together and made wooden planes, balloon tanks, and even fake headquarters with a combination of bussing in troops to pose for photos to make it seem like there were more people stationed there, as well as a complex use of propaganda and a very successful web of undercover agents that had infiltrated the German intelligence agencies to convince these German military leaders that the threats of these fake infantries was quite dangerous and that needed to be attended to. So as I said, there were two fake infantry positions, and this was Fortitude North and Fortitude South. Fortitude North was placed in Edinburgh, Scotland, and the purpose of this place was to convince Hitler and his generals that the invasion of the Allied powers was actually going to happen through Norway down into Sweden and thus into Germany. However, it wasn't the most main focus and didn't come across that practically. However, their wooden structures, balloon tanks, and things of that nature were so convincing that Hitler actually put 13 army divisions in Norway with expectation of an Allied invasion on that side. Now, more famously known as Fortitude South, because it was a fake infantry in southeast England, directly adjacent from Pas de Calais, which was across the English Channel. Now, the purpose of this, again, to confuse Hitler and make him believe that the invasion was actually going to happen in Pas de Calais. And it also convinced German General Rommel, and he ended up placing most of his tanks either north of Paris, between Paris and Pas de Calais, expecting, again, that invasion to occur there. Now, as you can see from this map, this is important because Pas de Calais seems like the most reasonable option and most sensible one for the Allied forces to take due to its closeness and geographical proximity to the British Isles. Navy ships and aircraft would have been able to easily get across, and it just seemed to make the most sense. However, as you would think, the Allies knew that Germany also expected and knew that this would be the most practical and sensible place to land. So they had to make this seem convincing for Fortitude South. To put the icing on the cake, they sent General George Patton to be stationed in this fake industry to make it even more believable. Now, General Patton was a very famous war veteran and general that had led both in the First World War and the Second, and was very successful in the early parts of World War II. However, unbeknownst to the German military, he had been suspended from active duty and actually leading men due to an incident of violence with his own men at the beginning of the war. But because of his fame and his general and his military prestige, the Germans took this threat and him being stationed there quite seriously and was successful in drawing much of the attention away from Normandy, which is exactly what the Allies needed, because they knew that the Germans did not expect the invasion to come down there because there was no signs of it happening to be so. Now, the Allies chose Normandy for its geographic and topographic advantages, but they needed that diversion from Operation Fortitude in order for this to be successful. So Operation Fortitude proves to become a vital component of the D-Day invasion, and the plan later became something that was so successful for the Allied powers. So to set the scene for the invasion strategy, you have to understand that throughout this whole process, it took months for them to come to the conclusion and the details of how they were going to come and carry out the plan. So the general basis and understanding of the plan is that they were going to first send airborne divisions behind the enemy lines in order to weaken reinforcement capabilities. Then on June 6th at 5 a.m., the invasion would begin. They divided Normandy into 5 beaches that had their own subsections themselves, and these 5 beaches were codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. The United States was responsible for the attack on Utah Beach and Omaha Beach, while British forces were responsible for Gold and Sword, and Canadian forces being responsible for Juno Beach. The airborne forces that I spoke about earlier coming in the night before the invasion were actually going to come in. The U.S. was going to come in behind Utah Beach in order to meet a couple of goals, and then the British airborne forces behind Sword Beach again to stop those reinforcement capabilities. The way that they chose to attack and put the men on the beach to go about the actual invasion itself was through amphibious methods, which was pretty new to the world at the time. But what they used was these boats that were called Higgins boats, and they could fit men, vehicles, supplies, whatever was needed in these areas, and they could be taken from larger battleships, dropped into the ocean, and then landing men onto the beach and the coast and the shore themselves. They also were going to use amphibious tanks that wrapped flotation devices around the tanks to get them eventually onto shore and then marching up the beach during the attacks. So the attack begins. June 5th at night, the British 6th Airborne Division lands and comes to do their goal. Their main objectives are to seize the only bridges on the Orne and Kane Canal. These bridges were called the Pegasus and Renville Bridge. They also were to take these bridges and then successfully defend against any counterattack that the Germans were going to bring to take back those bridges to bring their reinforcements in during the invasion on June 6th. The first to land from this airborne division were 6 gliders with only 180 men, and they were successful in taking the Pegasus Bridge with only 2 casualties and doing so in 15 minutes. This was also with extremely poor weather conditions, rain, heavy winds, lightning, cloud cover, making the mission even more difficult. However, they were extremely successful. Paratroopers soon followed, and they were able to also take Kane Canal. They were able to take the Renville Bridge and stop the reinforcements throughout the invasion the next day. Now, the Americans also had 2 airborne divisions. This was the 82nd Airborne Division, which nicknamed themselves the All-American Airborne Division. Then you had the 101st, and they were nicknamed the Screaming Eagles. Now, their main objectives, on the other hand, behind Utah Beach, as I mentioned earlier, was to take the city of Carentan and then also destroy as many artillery batteries as possible and just confuse the Germans and cause some havoc. So again, that poor weather was at work during the airborne invasion, and was much more costly for the Americans because so many of them missed their drop points. Some dropped out of the plane too soon, falling straight behind enemy lines and were shot down immediately, while others didn't come out of their plane fast enough and their parachute was not able to get out and stop and slow their fall fast enough. And so those people broke bones, lost supplies, and made their attack much more difficult. But for those that landed successfully, there was still great confusion. So due to this confusion, they were in fact unable to take the city that night. Later they did so the next week, but that night were not able to take the city. However, they were able to accomplish destroying 6 artillery batteries, which proved to be extremely crucial in the invasion of Utah Beach, and the Germans were quite confused and overwhelmed with all that was going on. Throughout the invasion of Normandy, these 2 divisions deployed 13,100 troops, and they only had 1,259 casualties. The bravery and determination of all these men, both from Britain and from America, has been applauded by historians for their success in very difficult circumstances. So the morning of June 6th finally comes for the Allied forces, and well, it comes with poor weather. So as that being said, The Allies decided to use air and sea bombardment to kind of weaken the defenses of the Germans before they put the men actually on the ground. But due to those poor weathers, heavy fog at 5 in the morning, these aircrafts were basically ineffective across most of the beaches and did a poor job of hitting their targets. Also, as far as the Navy bombardment goes, in order to keep their element of surprise, the generals elected not to do this attack for very long, keeping it short, therefore not causing as much destruction as was hoped leading into the plan. Now, for the bombs that were dropped, even though they didn't hit their desired points of batteries and garrisons and things of that nature, they were successful in destroying some of the roads and railroads behind the German military and behind that wall that I talked about earlier, and thus disrupted the reinforcements as they wanted to come in following the D-Day invasion. So the day comes, the bombardment has happened, and on Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, Canadian and British forces move in. So as I said earlier, the British is responsible for the Gold and Sword beach, and in the middle here you have the Canadian landing forces on Juno beach. Now, the initial fire of these attacks were extremely heavy and costly for these two nations and these invasions. However, the situation would get better. To the favor of the Allies, many of the defense troops happened to be too old or too young, as well as the fact that many were not even German in the first place. They were often times from German-occupied nations, but had little to no allegiance to Hitler and the Nazi regime themselves. The British and the Canadians were successful in getting most of their tanks as well onto shore, making this attack very successful, quick, and still yet costly, but successful in the end. By the end of D-Day, they had already brought over 900 tanks, hundreds of large machine guns, and more than 3,600 tons of supplies set and ready to go for their invasion of France and onward into Operation Overlord, the code name for the invasion of France. This plan was well executed, and the battle was victorious. But it did come at a cost. At the end of the day, there were 1,200 Canadian casualties and about 2,300 British casualties from the three beaches. Now, to the American side, things got a little dicey on Utah Beach. The strong tides and the currents moved many of these Higgins boats and tanks off course by as much as 8 kilometers in these choppy seas, 8 kilometers of their desired landing point. Now, this is important because the men had been briefed, officers had been told what to look for, what to see, and how they were going to go about the actual attack up the beach at Utah. They land, they miss their spot, and it doesn't look anything like they expected. However, this actually turns out to be more advantageous for the American forces because on the eastern flank where they missed, there actually had been a situation where a couple of the air bombings had been successful in taking out some of those artillery batteries and forced there to be less fire coming upon them from that side of the attack. With that being said, they still landed completely confused and bewildered and wondering how they were going to go about the rest of their attack. Thankfully, General Teddy Roosevelt Jr. was the only general, in fact, to join the men in the actual battle, and this proved to be absolutely crucial in the Utah Beach invasion. General Teddy Roosevelt was, in fact, the son of President Teddy Roosevelt. And this, in his old age, he actually lied about his health in order to convince the other military leaders that he should be able to go on this invasion. And with that being said, his presence proved to be valuable as he was able to organize the initial chaos and put the men in their right place. And as he famously is remembered for pacing across the beach, shouting orders and raising his pistol and leaning on his cane. He, just like his father, was leading the famous Rough Riders, used great leadership, bravery, and patriotism in the faces of American enemies. By 9 a.m., the tanks were on the ground, moving upward, and the beach had been taken. The invasion of Utah Beach had an estimated of 600 casualties that happened only in the span of a couple of hours. Omaha Beach did not have it like the others. There, the German defenses were the strongest. To make matters worse, only 5 of the 34 tanks that were planning on using their amphibious ways of getting to the beach actually made it. Many of them sank due to the high waves and the deep waters. Many of the Higgins boats that the men had been coming on capsized due to the high waves, or they lowered their hatch too soon. And this was extremely costly because some men drowned carrying heavy equipment. Others men, just in order to survive, lost their equipment, left it in the ocean, and were exhausted by the time they even got to the beach before the biting had even started. Once they got to the beach, there was no cover, only that of beach obstacles. They felt like the bullets were flying from everywhere, and the grenades and mines exploding. There was little tank cover, and the trauma of watching so many die in the first wave was very costly for the American forces. A memoir of one of the soldiers that was a part of the Omaha Beach invasion actually said, quote, "I became a visitor to hell," end quote. After the initial shock and heavy losses, the men realized that they had to get to the cliffs at the end of the beach. For the ones who got to the cliffs, they began climbing. And as they began climbing, they understood that they needed to get as many Germans killed inside of those German defenses in the cliffs as possible. So they began throwing grenades, firing machine guns, doing anything they can to kill any German inside of a hole. With the Germans moving in the tunnels due to the American advance and also the need to reload because of the constant firing that had happened during the beach siege, reinforcements were able to have a little bit of a break and were given time to come on shore. And this was extremely valuable overall throughout the course of the invasion, because this second wave, being able to successfully bring across more supplies and explosive, were able to make the paths easier to get to through the cliffs. Now, as I mentioned earlier about the Atlantic Wall, there's mines, there's barbed wire, and there's a lot of hidden booby traps that making getting anywhere on the beach extremely difficult. So with the second wave, being able to disarm these mines, explode the other pathways to the cliffs through the barbed wire, proved to be invaluable throughout the process. Navy destroyer spotters also noticed that as the men were advancing to the cliffs, climbing them and being successful in their invasion, they needed to help by shelling the German artillery. However, to do so was extremely dangerous and risky because of how close they had to get to the shore in order to be in range. This proved to be extremely crucial, and some historians even believe was the reason that the Omaha Beach invasion was successful at all. Once the Americans got to the top of the bluff, the battle completely shifted because they were able to successfully change their tactics to lateral attacks, attacking inside of those artillery batteries and taking Germans down piece by piece. Omaha was, without question, the most costly battle in D-Day. In total, there was an estimated 2,000 to 3,700 casualties on that beach alone. The sacrifice of these men was not a waste, however. The Allied forces were ultimately successful in every attack that they had on D-Day. General Dwight D. Eisenhower famously said about the D-Day invasion before it happened is that every obstacle must be overcome, every inconvenience suffered, and every risk run to ensure that our blow is decisive. We cannot afford to fail. And this ultimately proved true. This was the one shot the Allied forces had, because once they tried to make the invasion, the Germans would be prepared. But because they caught them off guard and they were successful on these beaches, they were able to shift the tide of the war and ultimately successfully invade Europe, get to Germany, and defeat the Nazi regime. In the end, the Allies were successful on June 6, 1944 on D-Day. But again, the cost was extremely high, with around 4,900 estimated casualties. The invasion of France, the conquest of Berlin, and the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany all started with the bravery and sacrifice of the men of these on this famous day. The bravery they displayed was extremely valuable, and for that, the whole world is forever thankful. These are my sources. thank you so much for your time.